By the 1780s, the situation had become quite complex internationally. Britain was at war with France and Spain, and of course it was at war with the United States as well. However, in 1780, they also went to war with the Dutch. By this point, we're beginning to see just how powerful the British actually were during this time period. Initially, they had managed to secure an army of 32,000 and ship them to Nova Scotia and then take New York City very early in the war. In a matter of a few months, they had assembled that massive army and also an enormous fleet. And then since that time, they had managed to hold off the French as well as the Spanish and continue to fight in North America. By that point, they were fighting on 5 different continents and 3 different oceans. As if that wasn't enough, in 1780, they also went to war with the Dutch. Now, initially, Britain had tried to get the Dutch on their side, and in fact, there had been cooperation between these two countries leading up to the American Revolution. But the Dutch were trying to hold a strict policy of neutrality. Britain had also tried to hire a small army from Holland for use in North America, much as they had done with the Prussian army. The Dutch had refused this as well. On the contrary, the Dutch began secretly sending supplies to the Americans through their colony in the Caribbean, St. Eustatius. That colony was slowly smuggling Dutch goods into America. Britain knew about it, but hadn't decided what they were going to do about it just yet. Britain had warned other European powers to not interfere with its American colonies, but the Dutch had refused that warning as well. In fact, you might recall that during the tea crisis, when Americans were boycotting tea, the tea that they preferred was Dutch tea, and Dutch tea was smuggled. It was also against Great Britain's treaties. So there was this situation. The Dutch were able to make a great deal of money, but on the other hand, they were going against what a very strong world power wanted. Britain began to point out a number of problems with how the Dutch was conducting its trade, especially around North America. And they also pointed out that there were a number of treaties that Britain and Holland had signed over the past several years. Those treaties meant that Holland was supposed to come to the defense of Britain, but the Dutch kept on refusing. The Dutch attempted to stay neutral, but by 1780, the situation had become dire. France had entered the war and desperately needed shipbuilding equipment in order to increase its own navy. The British, meanwhile, were blocking all American and French trade ships, and so the French could not get the necessary lumber and equipment into their ports. But there was a loophole. The Dutch were neutral, and they were considered a favored trading party. So Britain allowed those Dutch ships to pass, and sure enough, the Dutch began equipping the French and their naval building. In order to stop the Dutch, the British essentially had no choice. They had to do what they had to do. So they declared war on the Dutch in December 1780. Now, they were very worried about this declaration of war because the Dutch had been neutral up to this point, and they were worried that other neutral countries, such as Russia and Sweden, both of whom had some access to the sea, might come to the defense of the Dutch. So Britain created a document that outlined several of the non-neutral actions that the Dutch had been involved in, and then satisfied, they declared war. The war favored Britain heavily, and the Dutch were unmatched. They simply didn't have enough ships, and they didn't have enough sailors either. Britain was able to capture hundreds of Dutch cargo ships, both in the Caribbean and also in the North Sea, and they took those back to London and managed to regain some of their losses that had been occurring due to mostly French and Spanish privateers. But it also extended Britain still further. Additional battles occurred in Asia and Africa, and the Caribbean, of course. So by this point, any British ship in the Caribbean was pretty much vulnerable. An American could attack it, a Spanish ship, a French ship, or a Dutch ship. Britain had very little options in the Caribbean. My main point in bringing this up is to show just how powerful Britain was. In 1780, it was already at war with the French, and the Spanish and the Americans. And yet they were willing to go to war with the Dutch, and they won. That shows you how powerful the British were, and it also seems to indicate that 13 colonies had very little chance of success were it not for a global war erupting in Europe due to the American Revolution.